Good morning or good afternoon or good evening. So thank you for coming and joining this forum organized by Korean Society for Preventive Medicine and Public Health. Today, we like to talk about some COVID-19 situation in Sweden, especially focusing on the migrant persons. So let me invite Professor Mikael Rostila. He is the professor at the Public Health Science at Stockholm University. And he's going to talk about the COVID-19 morbidity, mortality, and vaccination rate among migrants in Sweden, findings based on total population data. So let me hand over to Professor Rostila.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Great opportunity to have a presentation in South Korea. My son just asked me today when I told him that I was going to have a talk in South Korea if I was traveling to South Korea today. But it's a great opportunity that we can use Zoom and digital solutions for this. So I'm going to talk about COVID morbidity, mortality, and vaccination rates, focusing on migrants in Sweden, and present some research findings on total population data, because during the pandemic, it has become evident that all groups are not equally affected by the coronavirus. Vulnerable groups, including ethnic minorities and migrants, seem to be overrepresented in many countries when it comes to infection and death rates, but also severe morbidity. So today I will show you some results on COVID-19 deaths and also severe illness from Sweden. The results are based on a couple of studies. One that is focusing on the sort of early pandemic, the early months in spring 2020, and the second one focusing also on the some remaining periods of the pandemic up till February 2021. But this is also work in progress, so we are still working on and we hope to present findings also on the remaining pandemic. But I will also give you a brief background to the Swedish pandemic response and the development of COVID-19 deaths and infection rates in Sweden, and also present some international comparisons. And I think that the Swedish results could be highly relevant also for many other countries that have a history of migration and large groups of migrants who are also socioeconomically deprived in their countries. And I hope also that these results could stimulate a discussion on why migrants are more impacted by the pandemic. We know that they are more impacted, but we should also try to find explanations for that. See, I'm trying to switch slide here now. So I will start saying something about the Swedish pandemic response, which has been discussed rather frequently, both in international mass media, but also by leaders in other societies globally. And during the early phase of the pandemic, the Swedish COVID strategy was heavily criticized by both international news as well as several political leaders and also academics. And there was a widespread view then that Sweden didn't take the pandemic really seriously and did not take any measures to reduce infection rates. There was a view that Sweden continued as before the pandemic, and we didn't take any measures to reduce infection rates. And Sweden was especially criticized because we didn't have a sort of general lockdown of society, which was common in many other countries. There was also a view that Sweden that the Swedish strategy was based on the focus on herd immunity. And here we see two pictures. One is a picture that was broadcasted on international news, showing a flourishing social life despite the pandemic in Sweden. And the other one is a picture of the Swedish state epidemiologist Anders Tegnell, who was actually quite famous and interviewed a lot in international mass media. He was sort of responsible for the Swedish pandemic response. But I would say that most of these views and sort of stereotypes did not really reflect reality. Sweden took several measures to reduce infection rates, but the overall assessment, and there has been some governmental reports on this, was that an overall combination of bad luck, poor elderly care and quality of elderly care, and that the Swedish efforts were too slow, especially really in the beginning of the pandemic, contributed to these initial high infection and death rates. And Sweden has, instead of having a more general lockdown, very much focused on behavioral recommendations, including social distancing, hand hygiene, bans of larger public gatherings, urging people to self-isolate if they have symptoms, and also working from home. However, restaurants, bars, stores, and shopping centers have remained open during the pandemic, although they have had limited opening hours. And I should also say that in the beginning of the pandemic, infection death rates were very high in Sweden when compared to many other countries. However, later on, during the second and third waves of the pandemic, infection and death rates have been fairly similar in Sweden when compared to other European countries. But also we should remember that the Swedish emphasis on behavioral recommendations with no general lockdown of society could, in the worst case, increase disparities in COVID morbidity and mortality, and increase infections in low SES groups and foreign-born, because they have greater difficulties in following behavioral recommendations due to poorer social and living conditions, and also that many of these groups have jobs that require face-to-face interaction. For example, in the service industry or in the healthcare system. Now, since the beginning of February 2022, all restrictions have been lifted in Sweden for vaccinated individuals. And also I should mention that during spring 2022, most citizens have also been offered a third vaccination. So I will show you some numbers on the development of the pandemic in Sweden. This is the daily new cases in Sweden during the pandemic between February 2020 and February 2022. In Sweden in total, we had about 2.5 million infected individuals out of a population of 10.4 million citizens. And here we can see clearly the different waves of the pandemic. But we also see a very low number of infected early on during the pandemic in Sweden. But this is not due to sort of actual infection rates. It's because we had very limited testing in the first phase of the pandemic during spring 2020. But we see especially increases in number of cases in the end and of the autumn and during the winter season of 2020. And again, then an increase during the spring 2021. And then especially we see a peak in the number of cases in the beginning of 2022. And you all know that this is due to the Omicron variant, which led to a very high number of infected in many countries, including Sweden. This is the daily number of deaths in Sweden throughout the pandemic and until late February this year. The total number of deaths in Sweden is almost 18,000. And you can see that we had a very high number of deaths already early on in the pandemic. So we peaked very, very early, especially in April and May 2020. Then the death rate started to fall during the summer months, but increased rapidly again around November 2021, when also the number of infections increased. And we can see a new peak in the number of deaths in early 2022 due to the Omicron variant. But now the number have decreased again in Sweden. And that is, of course, partly also explained by that the Omicron variant is milder and that we are now to a large extent vaccinated with 2 or 3 shots. Here we can see the cumulative confirmed COVID-19 deaths per million people in different countries around the world. And in an international perspective, you can see that the death rates in Sweden are comparable to most other European countries, although then Sweden had high initial death rates, as I showed you. But on the other hand, Sweden have had much higher death rates when compared to our neighbors, the other Nordic countries, Finland and Norway. So I think that's also a reason for this debate, that we are often compared to our neighbors rather than to other European countries. And then we see share of people who completed COVID vaccination. And this slide shows that Sweden has also very high vaccination rates, over 80%. Now I think almost 90% have received at least 2 doses of vaccine, and many have also received their 3rd dose now. But then I will move on after this short introduction to the Swedish pandemic response and the situation in Sweden to a migrant focus, because already early on during the pandemic, there were signs of higher COVID mortality in migrants and ethnic minorities. I think this was already discussed during the sort of first couple of weeks in Sweden during the pandemic, that there were signs that neighborhoods that were segregated and with a high percentage of migrants had very high death rates in COVID-19. But this was also showed early on in other countries, primarily the US and the UK. So during the remaining time of my talk, I will focus on the COVID-19 situation among migrants in Sweden. So despite the widely adopted message that the virus does not discriminate, then preliminary evidence suggests that the interaction between COVID-19 and the social environment does, pointing to a higher morbidity and mortality among low socioeconomic groups and minority groups. So there is an urgent need to study social and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality, but now also in terms of vaccination rates and understand the mechanisms behind them, also when thinking about future pandemics. And for two main explanations for higher COVID mortality, but also severe illness can be distinguished. The first one relates to vulnerabilities due to a generally lower socioeconomic status among migrants, which then implies poorer living conditions. So not being able to successfully socially isolate due to low income or crowded housing conditions is likely to amplify both infection and subsequently death rates. Another explanation highlights the higher prevalence of underlying risk factors in migrants, or higher genetic vulnerability for infectious diseases, leading to a higher fatality rate or risk of serious illness. It has been shown in Sweden that migrants have a higher risk of diabetes, high BMI. Some groups have higher risks of coronary health problems, but some groups also have a higher share of adverse health behaviors, such as smoking, low physical activity, and alcohol consumption. And this might then also explain a higher mortality and severe morbidity in some migrant groups. Just showing you some examples of research early on during the pandemic. There was a county level study in the US that found that counties with higher proportions of Black residents had more COVID-19 diagnoses and deaths very early on during the pandemic. Then we saw some UK studies, one that documented an increased risk of COVID-19 death for Black African, Black Caribbean, Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi ethnic groups in the UK. Another study in the UK found that compared to white study members, Black individuals had a fourfold increased risk of COVID-19 infection, and that there was a doubling of risk among Asians and other non-whites. And another study found that Blacks and South Asian migrants were more likely to test positive for COVID-19, but they were also more likely to be hospitalized than white British. So this was findings very early on during the pandemic, and also led us to sort of start to study this in Sweden. And of course, the number of publications and empirical results on migrants and ethnic minorities on COVID-19 deaths and morbidity has increased enormously since the beginning of the pandemic. So what I will do today is that I will show you some empirical findings on disparities in COVID-19 deaths by country of birth during the first phase of the pandemic during spring 2020 in Stockholm, Sweden. This was our first study focusing on migrants. We started to work on this paper already in early May 2020, so it was really covering just the first few months of the pandemic. We also focused on Stockholm because Stockholm was the region most severely affected by the pandemic early on. And after that, the COVID infection rates started to increase also in other parts of Sweden, but Stockholm was the most severely affected region, which is also Stockholm, the capital. Then I will show findings on all-cause mortality disparities excluding COVID-19 deaths during the first phase of the pandemic, to show you that migrants are very much vulnerable to the COVID-19. I will show you whether such disparities in both mortality and morbidity are also found later on during the pandemic. This was another study that we performed where we could follow individuals until spring 2021. And then I will also show findings on whether socioeconomic status, such as education, income, and employment, and living conditions, such as housing type, crowded housing conditions, and neighborhood population density, accentuate disparities in COVID-19 mortality and morbidity by country of birth. And finally, I will also show you some results on vaccination rates by country of birth, because it's of course very important that also migrant gets vaccinated in order to avoid also higher mortality in COVID in the future. Something very briefly about the data. The data come from national Swedish registries, including the total Swedish population. This is an excellent opportunity that we have in Sweden, that we have this nationwide register data where we can follow individuals, and we have a lot of information about different types of conditions and also health and hospitalizations and mortality. So these registries have been used, including then deaths and intensive care hospitalizations due to COVID-19. Data for Stockholm was used in the first analysis of the first phase of the pandemic between January 31st and May 4th, 2020. As I told you, it was the mostly affected region. And data for the rest of Sweden was used when studying later phase of the pandemic between March 2020 and February 2021. And Poisson regressions with region or country of birth as exposure and underlying cause of death or intensive care due to COVID-19 as an outcome was performed. And we also then adjusted for several potential mediators and confounders, including education, income, occupation, household type, civil status, crowded housing conditions, and population density. So turning to some of the results from our studies, this is Poisson regression models for COVID-19 deaths and deaths from all other causes except COVID-19 grouped by country of birth for people living in Stockholm. And this is adjusted and unadjusted for predictors. So what this figure shows is that COVID-19 mortality risks in different groups based on region of birth. You see that on the left-hand panel. We see very high mortality in several of the groups based on country of birth. The red dots here represents the age-adjusted relative risks, while the gray dots are mortality risks adjusted for socioeconomic variables, household factors, and neighborhood population density. And as you can see in the left-hand panel, model 1 represented by the red dots, people born in Nordic countries and especially Middle East and Africa have very high COVID-19 mortality risks when compared to Swedish-born individuals. If we focus on country of birth then. When the analyses are adjusted for socioeconomic conditions and housing conditions, if you look at the gray dots, the excess risks are reduced considerably. However, foreign-born still have higher COVID-19 mortality. And This is an indication and suggests that the mediating variables can explain much, but not all, the disparities in COVID-19 mortality during this first phase of the pandemic. If we look at the right-hand panel, we can see that most foreign groups have lower mortality from other causes than COVID-19 during the pandemic. And this is a result that is quite common in Sweden, that there is actually a mortality health paradox, that several migrant groups have lower mortality compared to Swedish-born individuals. So if we look at these and compare these figures, we can definitely conclude that migrants have been particularly vulnerable to the COVID-19 infection and the pandemic. If we look at this next slide, it shows COVID-19 mortality from all other causes during the pandemic, but comparing that to COVID-19 mortality. And this is just based on the previous slide, but here we see more detailed countries of birth. And so we can see, for example, if people born in, for example, Somalia or Syria differ when it comes to COVID-19 mortality from those born in Sweden then. And what we see here is then that individuals born in Somalia, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Iran, Iraq have particularly high COVID-19 mortality. Socioeconomic variables, household factors, and neighborhood population density accounts for some, but not all, of their excess COVID-19 mortality. If we compare the red dots on the left-hand side with the gray dots. We can also see higher COVID mortality also in other migrant groups, such as those born in Chile, Greece, Cyprus, for example, and their excess risks are also totally explained by the mediating variables. But if we look at mortality risks from other causes of death, excluding COVID-19, they are generally similar or lower than for Swedish-born, especially in the fully adjusted models. So here we see a more detailed picture then based on specific country of birth in migrants in Sweden. And corresponding to the previous slide, we can clearly see that many migrant groups have a much higher COVID-19 mortality. So how did then COVID-19 impact migrants later on during the pandemic? We have been working together with the Swedish Public Health Agency on a report, also looking at COVID-19 mortality and morbidity during the rest of the pandemic. And the objective was then, of course, to give a more up-to-date description of what happened next. And this is, of course, something that we are still working on. So do we also find COVID-19 increased COVID-19 mortality and morbidity later on during the pandemic? Here we had the possibility to also study intensive care hospitalizations as a measure of severe morbidity. And here we see on the left-hand side of the figure relative risks in different groups or categories of migrants when compared to Swedish-born individuals. who are set to 1, that is the reference category. And the slide then shows higher risks of intensive care hospitalizations among all foreign-born groups, except those from North America compared to native Swedes. And we can see especially high relative risks for intensive care hospitalizations among migrants from Africa, the Middle East, South America, Asia and Oceania, and Southeast Europe. Migrants from African countries and the Middle East, for example, have more than 5 times higher risk of intensive care hospitalization compared to Swedish-born. Moving on then to mortality due to COVID-19 later on during the pandemic. This is higher risks of COVID-19 deaths among all foreign-born groups except those from North America compared to native Swedes. So these groups have again higher also mortality risks. We can see especially high relative risks for COVID-19 deaths among migrants from Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Europe, for example. And migrants from African countries and the Middle East have about 3 times or 3.5 times higher mortality risk in COVID-19 compared to Swedish-born individuals. So, if we then also look at what happened during different waves of the pandemic in the different migrant groups, this slide shows how disparities in COVID-19 intensive care by region of birth have developed during the pandemic between March 2020 and January 2021. And we can see here that there was a decrease in the risk of care among those mostly affected by the first wave, Africa, Middle East, and South America, but also that the increased risks have remained. The risk of care for individuals born in Africa was the highest during the first wave of the pandemic, and migrants from other regions had a higher risk during the second wave, such as those from the Middle East, South America, Southeast Europe, and Asia and Oceania. So to conclude, basically all migrant groups were more affected than Swedish-born during both waves of the pandemic that is shown here in terms of serious illness. This slide shows how disparities in COVID-19 deaths by region of birth have developed during the pandemic between March 2020 and January 2021. And we can see that there was a decrease in the COVID-19 mortality risk among those mostly affected in the first wave, those born in Africa and Middle East, but also that the increased risks still have remained. So they still had higher risks compared to Swedish-born. And the COVID mortality risks was highest for individuals born in Africa and Middle East during the first wave then. Migrants from other regions had a higher risk during the second wave, such as those from Southeast Europe, for example. But also here to conclude, most migrant groups had higher mortality in COVID-19 during both waves of the pandemic compared to Swedish-born. So can we also explain the disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality by country of birth by disadvantaged social and living conditions? And this is something that is possible to study to a great extent with our Swedish register data, because we have a lot of information about socioeconomic variables and living conditions. And the final 2 slides here shows the risks of COVID-19 morbidity and mortality before and after adjustment for socioeconomic status and living conditions. And a reduction in the relative risk after adjustment for such variables suggest that conditions and such conditions could then explain disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality by country of birth. And this first slide then shows that the relative risks for intensive care hospitalizations decrease substantially in the different region of birth groups after adjustment for socioeconomic status and living conditions such as income, education, household type, crowded housing conditions, and population density in the residential area. As you can see in this slide, when you compare the green and the blue bars, the green bars which are unadjusted and the blue bars that are adjusted, is that up to half of the increased risks are explained by such conditions. Moving to mortality then, this slide shows the relative risks for COVID-19 mortality in different region of origin groups when compared to Swedish born. And we can see also here that the increased mortality risks in these groups decreases substantially after adjustment for socioeconomic status and living conditions. The same variables as in the previous slide: income, education, household type, crowded housing conditions, and population density. And also here, more than half of the increased risks are explained by such conditions, if you compare the green and blue bars here. And finally, in order to avoid COVID-19 death or severe disease, it is of course important to get vaccinated, especially in the older ages. And this slide shows some simple descriptive statistics about the percentage of individuals who received at least 3 doses of vaccine by country of birth and age on February the 9th, 2022. The green bar shows vaccinations in Swedish born, the purple bar among those European foreign born, and the orange bars vaccination in non-European migrants in Sweden. And we can see very clear differences by country of birth in all age groups and migrants, and that the percentage of migrants who received their third dose is much lower when compared to Swedish born in all these age groups, especially among those migrants that were born outside Europe. And given that death rates are still fairly high in Sweden, it is especially alarming that only around 60% of those aged 70 and above have received their third dose among non-European migrants, while the corresponding number among Swedish born is over 90%. So this could indicate that these inequalities in death rates might still continue as long as the pandemic continues. So to sum up, we found substantially higher COVID-19 mortality among migrants from Middle Eastern countries and Africa, but also among migrants from the Nordic countries when compared to Swedish-born individuals during the first phase of the pandemic. All this is in sharp contrast to the results reported for all-cause mortality excluding COVID-19, where most migrant groups have lower mortality when compared to native Swedes during the pandemic. So migrants are more vulnerable to, especially to the COVID-19 infection then. We also found large disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality by country of birth later on during the pandemic, and differences in socioeconomic status and living conditions explain much of these increased COVID-19 morbidity and mortality rates in foreign-born. And vaccination seems to follow the same pattern. Migrants show lower vaccination rates. So just to make some sort of conclusions and discussion. So poorer socioeconomic conditions seem to explain some of the higher COVID-19 mortality in migrants, and poor SES translates into occupations that are more precarious, are often found in the service sector, where personal contact is more frequent and the possibility of working from home is limited. It is also well known that socioeconomic position is strongly associated with several diseases and health problems and health risk behaviors that could increase the risk of COVID-19 deaths in migrants, but also severe COVID illness. The adjustment for socioeconomic position could therefore account for both risk factors inherent in low status occupations with more personal contact and underlying comorbidities explaining the higher COVID-19 mortality in foreign-born individuals. After adjustment for the number of working age people in the household and population density, excess COVID-19 morbidity and mortality risks were additionally reduced across migrant groups, and migrants living and social conditions could then make social distancing more difficult, which could lead to a high risk of virus transmission. And in general, these results align with the fundamental causes of disease theory, that is, country of birth or ethnicity is a fundamental cause of disease, in this case, COVID-19 infection. Similarly to most diseases and health problems, the increased risk of COVID-19 mortality in foreign-born reflects that those who are most or worse positioned with regard to important social and economic resources will be more afflicted to COVID-19. So it's crucial to continue to study risk factors explaining migrants' higher prevalence in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality in order to prevent such disparities in Sweden and other countries, and also for the sake of future pandemics. Additional information on genetic predisposition and genetic vulnerability, underlying health problems and health risks, social interaction patterns, language proficiency, adherence to guidelines and information, and cultural and religious attitudes and norms regarding virus transmission could contribute also to the understanding of disparities in COVID-19 by country of birth. So these are things that we need to study in the future. And there is also an urgent need for policies and action to reduce disparities in COVID in vaccination rates by country of birth. The only option left, I would say, to erase COVID-19 disparities by country of birth. So I will end there. If you are interested, you can read more by downloading some of these publications on Swedish data. I could also mention that we have now an ongoing project with colleagues from Denmark and Netherlands about post-COVID and longer-term health consequences by COVID-19 infection. We are also working then with updated evidence on COVID-19 mortality and morbidity in migrants together with the Public Health Agency here in Sweden. And we also have an ongoing research project, especially focusing on COVID mortality differentials by country of birth in Sweden. So I will stop there, and questions and comments are welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Rostila. For me, it was quite interesting and useful and meaningful presentation, which covers Swedish pandemic response in general, as well as the key findings in relation to the migrants in Sweden in terms of morbidity and mortality. Before I ask some questions from the floor, let me start with my question first.
Yep.
So, even though you have covered many things in your discussion slide, but one of my questions is related with the prevalence of the COVID among migrants, because in your slide, you focus on the intensive care unit, the relative risk, and then mortality. So I just wonder whether this high mortality or high intensive care utilization is because of they have got, more infected, or there's some problem in terms of the healthcare utilizations. Can be both, but what is your interpretation, the reason behind the high mortality?
So you mean if the sort of underlying reason for this is higher infection rates, or is it that they are more vulnerable to when they actually get the disease?
Yeah, I think it can be both. For example, because of their social economic status or behavior and so on, they can get more vulnerable to the infection, and also they would be more vulnerable in terms of healthcare utilization. But I just wonder, because there's no data about the prevalence of this COVID-19 among migrants.
And we do have that information. We present it in the same report, where we also present death rates and also intensive care. And I agree. I mean, many migrant groups have higher infection rates also. I should start with, but I think that there is some kind of interaction also between higher vulnerability and higher actual infection rates. So I think it is a combination here. One reason for why I didn't present this number of cases here, and why it is a bit difficult to study this in Sweden, is that in Sweden we have had, as I mentioned, very poor testing possibilities, especially early on during the pandemic. So we can't really, study this, especially in the first phase of the pandemic. We can study it later on, but also then testing, I think, has been fairly poor in Sweden. So we can't really say that, okay, all infected individuals have also undergone a test and we have a positive test result, because there is, I think, also a huge uncertainty, and there might be a lot of infected people, especially in migrant groups, which are not tested. So that is a problem in Sweden, unfortunately.
I understood. So, and I guess they would not be available about the result from antibody studies. So among Swedish and migrants, if we have that antibody study, then you may guess the real prevalence of this first phase of the infection. By the way, if I understood correctly, your most finding is from March 2022 to January 2021, which is before the vaccination program started. So I just wonder whether you also have some similar data after vaccination, program started. You showed us that the vaccination rate also is quite lower in the migrants group. However, since they have, they might have more natural immunity, so they could be better protected for the third or fourth wave. So I'm not sure whether the mortality rate is still high in third or fourth wave of the pandemic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have this excellent opportunity in Sweden to study people in our nationwide registries. The problem is that it is fairly slow to get the data for research purposes. So often we have sort of a lag of 6 months or a year before we can produce some updated evidence. So I think it will be very interesting to see now how these numbers looks like after the vaccinations. But yeah, not to be too negative, but I think actually that it might still be that we see similar risks in migrants, and I fear that the disparities might be even larger, because I know that already early on when we started vaccination, the percentage and the vaccination rates in migrants were much lower than among native Swedes. And I still think that vaccination is the most important way to sort of avoid severe COVID disease or death. But yeah, I think it's a question. It's a very good question, and I think it remains to be seen how it looks like. Also, for example, during the Omicron wave, which will be very interesting to study, and that's one of the next steps in our analysis.
Thank you very much for your kind feedback. So I believe that there are many people, watching this through YouTube Live. However, in this Zoom, you have other 2 participants only. So I just wonder whether the Mingu Kang or Sebelgon has any question to Professor Rostila. 질문할 거 혹시 있으세요?
네, 해도 되나요?
네네, 말씀하세요.
Hello, this is Mingu Kang. I'm a graduate student and resident physician from Korea University. Thank you for your thorough presentation. I have a question that I see that there's in phase 1, in pandemic phase 1, there's a much higher relative risk in Africa or people from Africa or Asia, but as shown in figure, phase 2 to 3, but there's not really have higher relative risk in people from Africa or Asia. So what's the reason for the different data? Could you please explain?
Yeah, a very good question also, and I think continuing studying the different waves is something also that we need to do in the future. I mean, it could be, as was mentioned before, that having a lot of infected during the first phase led to some kind of immunity, and that the intensive care and death rates then was reduced during the second and third wave in these groups, for example, the African group. Another explanation that has been put forward is that during the first phase of the pandemic, migrants, especially those who do not speak Swedish well, that they did not get proper information about protection measures, which could then lead to sort of higher infection rates and death rates. But then later on during the pandemic, the sort of information improved and was also given in other languages than Swedish. But yeah, those are 2 potential explanations, but which one is the right one, we don't know yet. So I think we should continue to try to explain these disparities over time and see how it looks like during different waves of the pandemic.
All right.
Thank you for your kind explanation.
Thank you.
Any other question from floor? All right. Even though the most of participants is from Korea and they might be more interested in the Swedish situation. However, using this opportunity, if you, Professor Rostila, you have any question to Korea situation in relation to COVID-19 response, you can use this opportunity, or you can ask through email. However, 1 or 2 questions if you have.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not. My field of research in general is sort of studying social inequalities in health, and in Sweden, we have not only seen disparities by country of birth or between different migrant groups, but also that your income level, your education, for example, and your occupational status impacts and leads to higher COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. So yeah, I don't know if there are any studies in South Korea on sort of maybe you have a different migrant population probably.
Yeah, sure.
And so it's difficult to compare, but if you have any studies on that or any results on social inequalities in COVID-19.
Speaking of migrants in Korea, I guess about 3 or 7% of population is from abroad now.
Yeah.
But there's different reasons, as you know. Some are migrants for work, some are migrants for marriage, and others. So as per their situation, such as the region to visit Korea or their original countries, their cultural or world situation is quite different. But I am not fully aware of the studies completed or undergoing in relation to these migrants in Korea, but there must be some few. However, in terms of vulnerable group in COVID-19 in Korea, we also focusing on the long-term care facilities, like elderly who stayed in long-term care hospital or nursing home, and also the unstable workers, for example, working at call center or this kind of the vulnerable workers also quite vulnerable to the COVID-19. So there are a few, the interest for ongoing studies, I believe, in terms of the social economic, the inequality in relation to the COVID-19. But yeah, I hope sooner or later we can share some result to you, but not from my side, but from my other colleagues in Korea. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be extremely interesting. I think I should have also mentioned maybe that I didn't give a background to migration because we didn't really have time for that. But in Sweden, you might not know, but we have over 20% of the population is born in another country. So we have a quite massive migrant population and also many refugees coming quite recently to Sweden. But we also have a quite big group that came for labor in the 60s and 70s to Sweden. So yeah, and it would also be interesting to continue to study the children of migrants or the second generation migrants and see whether they also have higher COVID-19 mortality and morbidity, because they share a lot of these socioeconomic conditions with their parents, of course.
Thank you very much for your further background, explanation. All right, now exactly 1 hour. So
yep.
Thank you again for your time, even though a bit early morning in your place. And I hope we can meet face to face in sooner or later.
That would be very nice.
This. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. 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 Thank you.